Hello and welcome to Creation Questions. Today I'm going to be opening up for anyone who wants to come in and challenge the conclusion that God exists. So while I'm waiting, I'm going to be going through a few logical syllogisms about the existence of God. And if no one shows up during or after that time, then I'm going to end the stream. So if you want to join and discuss this with me, you can click the link in the chat. It's pinned to the top. So here we go. Here are a few arguments for God and a few extra against naturalism. So first argument, Kalam cosmological argument. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe must have a cause. So, premise 1. In our everyday experience, everything that we see that begins to exist, there is some thing in which that thing is brought about by. So the only way that, for instance, we can make sense of causal chains is to say that one thing is caused, right? So this is sort of I guess it's a more intuitive premise. It's not usually questioned very often, but it's been questioned. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. This is demonstrated by a few things. For instance, you could point to thermodynamics, and we see, for instance, that things in nature go from a state of, high order or high free energy to a state of increasing entropy. And you can also see, for instance, evidence from, for instance, like redshift, that the universe is expanding, and that implies that that in the past there was a point in which there could be no more. Basically, there could be no more contracting. There's a point of finitude in which the universe is as small as it's going to get, essentially. You could also look at logical arguments, like arguments against infinite causal chains, like the Grim Reaper paradox, for instance. Anyway, therefore the universe must have a cause. Now, why does that cause have to be God? There are a few reasons. One is going to be that a thing that causes the universe must be outside the universe. Therefore, it's going to be timeless, immaterial, and spaceless. And God is essentially known by those attributes. Okay, let's move on. Fine-tuning argument. So, premise 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. So those are 3 options there. Premise 2, it is not due to physical necessity or chance. Therefore, conclusion, it is due to design, and that would be God. So for premise one, it just stands to reason that by saying the universe is either created by necessity, chance, or design, you've exhausted the options, the possible options for how the universe could be created. Premise two, why is that true? That the universe is not created due to necessity or chance? Well, because the way in which for instance, physical laws and universal constants operate is they are very finely tuned, where we exist, for instance, in the universe is very finely tuned. From anything like the amount of water to the location of the moon and the sun to where we orbit in our galaxy or in our solar system, and the constituents of are like the material that exists on Earth. There are ample reasons to think that the universe is finely tuned in all different fields. And if that's true, then it makes it extremely unlikely that we exist in this particular universe. If it is extremely unlikely that we exist in this particular universe, it makes it very dubious to suggest that this universe was brought about by chance or necessity. Therefore, design is the best, most plausible inference. Okay, moving on. Okay, so here's the moral argument. Premise one, if objective moral values exist, an objective moral lawgiver exists. Premise two, objective moral values exist. Conclusion, therefore, an objective moral lawgiver exists. And we would call an objective moral lawgiver God. So, premise one, why do we know that it's true that if objective moral values exist, then an objective moral lawgiver exists? Well, we can basically rule out any other scenario, such as chance or necessity, because objective moral values are transcendent of anything that natural laws can create. Premise two, how do we know that objective moral values exist? There are particular intuitions that every culture, every people group in the history of humanity have all understood tacitly. For instance, that in some sense it's wrong to be treated unfairly, for instance, or it's wrong to commit genocide, or it's wrong to commit other atrocities. Therefore, objective moral law necessitates a moral lawgiver, and objective moral values can be inferred to exist at least. And if we can infer objective moral values, then that necessitates objective moral law. Okay. Here's one of my favorite arguments. Here's the intelligent design argument. So this is something that I kind of synthesized from a couple people. This is Stephen Meyer has a similar argument. Um, he says all codes require a coder. That's basically it. And this one is premise one: all systems which have form, function, and information require an intelligent designer. Premise two: biological systems have form, function, and information. Conclusion: therefore, biological systems require an intelligent designer, God. So, why is premise one true? So think about what form and function and information are. So, for instance, if I take a watch and I put it in a box and I give it to a chemist and I say to the chemist, okay, you can know all the chemical processes that are going on. You can know all the constituents, and you have, as a given, the physical laws. And can you tell me then, is this watch a functioning watch? Is it functional? It's very hard to say that you could say that that chemist would be able to tell you that answer, unless there was some sort of knowledge outside of the system itself about what functionality is and what that entails. So that's sort of form and function. And then what is information? I look at information as in sort of linguistic or semiotic information, similar to Charles Sanders' Peirce, or what someone like a Kantian, or more like a more like a Reidian view of information, of signs and the signified, the objects, where there is some physical sign which signifies there's sort of an abstract quality or an external quality to the system. It signifies an object. The object is not itself the sign. So, okay, so premise two: biological systems have form, function, and information. So we see in biology, for instance, we see things like body plans. We see structures like the eye. We see structures like the hand, and these and we see structures like the lungs. For instance, what is the lungs role? It's to take in oxygen and give to the blood. And what is the function of an eye? It's to take in light and specifically take in different waveforms of light. And therefore, because you can identify this distinction between what is a working eye, what is a working lung, what is a working hand, and what isn't, then you must suppose a higher level of structure, which would be form and function. And in regards to information, there is, for instance, in DNA, the system of transcribing from mRNA into amino acids, which form proteins. And this process necessitates an abstract signaling of codons to amino acids. There's no chemical necessity that any given codon must be programming any specific amino acid. So in many ways, biological systems have form, function, and information. And then therefore the conclusion follows that biological systems require an intelligent designer, and anything that's sufficient to create biology at least must be something with a mind, something with a great level of intelligence that's higher than even any kind of human intelligence. Granted, this argument can only go so far, so I have got in parentheses, but it's only really inferred that we mean an intelligent designer by this argument. But the cumulative case from all these slides is hopefully to indicate the power of the explanation of God. So here's the next slide. Here's the ontological argument. This one is very interesting. Basically, the ontological argument, first sort of like pinned by Anselm, is the whole premise is this idea, this concept of the greatest conceivable being. Basically, what that is can you think of a being in which no greater being exists? So premise one, if it is possible that a greatest possible being exists in some possible world, then that greatest conceivable being exists in every possible world. So if it's conceivable that, for instance, there is some, not necessarily multiverse, but some reality where this greatest possible being exists, and you can conceive of that, then that possible world is not this. If it just exists in that possible world, then it must, in order to be the greatest possible being, it must exist in every possible world, because you could conceive of a greater possible being if it just exists in some possible world. Premise two, it is possible that the greatest possible being exists in some possible world. Therefore, the greatest possible being exists in every possible world. So therefore, it exists in our world. Therefore, God exists. So if someone comes up, we can go in more into detail in that argument. If someone wants to debate that argument, but for now, I'm going to gloss over some of the nuances here. Okay. Here's the argument from a priori truths. This is sometimes formulated by some presuppositional apologists, but I am formulating it as a syllogism. Hello. Someone is here. Wouldn't the sound conclusion be, therefore, the greatest possible being could exist in every world? Well, okay, let's go back. So if it is possible that the greatest possible being exists in some possible world, then that greatest possible being exists in every possible world. So are you just talking about the inferential nature of this proposition? Therefore, it is possible that the greatest conceivable being exists in every possible world? I think that's fine. Unless you're making a different argument there. You can elaborate. To go back to the argument from a priori truths. 1, if a priori truths exist, and these are things like synthetical judgments like mathematical truths, geometry, arithmetic, and also things like logic. So a priori exists in minds. So if a priori truths exist, they must exist in some mind, either contingent or non-contingent. Okay, so premise 2, a priori truths exist outside all contingent minds. So conclusion, therefore, a priori truths exist in a non-contingent mind, and that would be God. The reason why premise 2 is true is because if something can be true outside whether or not you believe it's true, then it exists regardless of whether you exist. Therefore, it's not contingent on your mind. Therefore, it must have some non-contingent mind that it exists in. And again, we can talk about this if someone wants to come up. Moving on. Okay, so this is the argument from agency. Premise 1. If naturalism is true, all human actions are the result of physical laws and prior physical states. Premise 2. Human beings possess true agency. This is really what's going to be debated in this particular argument. This is sort of the concept of libertarian free will, or what I write, the ability to initiate actions freely and intentionally. Conclusion, therefore, naturalism is false, and there must exist a transcendent source of agency, which we would call God. I think this one is fairly self-explanatory. I think the main contention for this one is just going to be premise 2. If you don't believe that free will exists, then you're not going to accept the conclusion here. However, I think that free will, as far as our sort of tacit experience, is going to be, and maybe that's redundant, but basically in our personal experience, we have the tendency to believe that we have free will. So it would seem to stand to reason that the burden of proof would be on the person who says, whoever doesn't, like the person who says that we don't have free will, it seems like they would have to argue why we don't have free will, because that kind of goes against our common everyday experience. Okay, so you get this one. Moving on. Okay, here's the argument from desire. So this is sort of a C.S. Lewis argument here. Premise 1. Every natural, innate desire in us corresponds to some real object that can satisfy that desire. So you can think of basically any desire, like hunger. If you think about, like, well, we're hungry. Why are we hungry? Because there's food. Because we can eat. Because we can satisfy that desire. Like you can think of like desire for relationships, for instance. Like why are people lonely? Because that's a sort of like a deficiency which can be fulfilled by another person or another creature, for instance. So any desire that you think of, and I'm sure there are a lot, I just don't have a whole lot on the top of my head, but it stands to reason that they can be fulfilled. There's something real in reality that can satisfy that desire. Okay, premise 2. There exists in us a desire which nothing in time, nothing on earth, and no creature can satisfy. So this is sort of a, how does he describe it? It's sort of like a sense of true fulfillment or true happiness or true telos, which it doesn't seem can be satisfied here on this earth or with anything or with anyone. It seems like there's something greater out there, and if you have that intuitive feeling, then that supports premise 2. Conclusion, therefore, there must exist something more than time, earth, and creatures or creation, and that would be God. Okay, let's move on. Okay, here's the argument from contingency, or the Leibnizian argument. Okay, premise 1: anything that exists has an explanation of its own existence, either intrinsically or extrinsically. So what does that mean? So intrinsically, if something is intrinsically explained, then it doesn't need any external explanation. It's sufficient by its own nature explanatorily. And something that's extrinsic is going to be requiring something external or something outside of itself to explain its existence. So premise 2: the universe does not have to exist by its own nature, i.e., it exists extrinsically. Therefore, conclusion that follows, the universe must have an extrinsic explanation. And again, this is sort of like the Kalam. We ask ourselves, what is an explanation of the universe that could possibly be extrinsic to it? And we say that's going to be timeless, that's going to be immaterial, that's going to be spaceless, and it's going to have some sort of sufficient power and intelligence to create something like a universe. Therefore, we're going to say that that is God. Okay, moving on. So here are some arguments, and these are more arguments against naturalism. I picked like 2 or 3. So here's the argument from intelligibility. Premise 1: if our minds are the products or the product of material processes, they are not capable of grasping abstract truths. Premise 2: however, our minds are capable of grasping abstract truths about the universe. Conclusion, sorry, not premise. Conclusion, therefore, our minds are not the product of purely unguided material processes. Okay, here's another similar one. Here's the multiverse argument against naturalism. So this is a way in which, if someone is going to use the multiverse to explain, for instance, fine-tuning and other design arguments, then they are susceptible to what's known as the multiverse argument against naturalism. Premise 1 states, if there exist real things not entirely composed of the observed constituents of nature, i.e. matter, energy, physical laws, then naturalism is false. Premise 2, the multiverse is not entirely composed of the observed constituents of nature. That means, for instance, physical constants are different, which is required to get over, for instance, the fine-tuning. Sometimes even I've seen some people say, for instance, instead of space and matter, or instead of, for instance, energy, a universe could be composed entirely of mathematical, abstract notions. So there are some different variations of a multiverse, and then the question is, what do you mean by multiverse, right? But generally, what they mean by multiverse is going to break this sort of naturalistic paradigm. So premise 2, the multiverse is not entirely composed of the observed constituents of nature. See, therefore, naturalism is false. So the one escape which some would consider the best escape to the fine-tuning argument, which some scientists especially view as the most powerful argument for God, fails to protect the assumption that God cannot exist. So it's an interesting defeater there. This one is a very popular argument. I think there are many. I forget exactly who popularized this argument, but was it Plantinga? Oh, okay. Let's look at this comment here. I like the multiverse argument that states there is a universe where God is real, therefore God is real. Let's go back. So help me out here, Mr. Green. Is it Mr. Green or Mr. Greeny? What premise is stating this? This argument is not concluding that God is real. It's concluding that naturalism is false. Both are fine. Okay. So this is sort of supplementary to the fine-tuning argument. This is an argument for God. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. I'm gonna keep going. So yeah, like I said, I think maybe Lewis or Plantinga or somebody. I'm trying to remember. I'm sorry, I can't remember. But anyway, premise 1: if naturalism and evolution are both true, and I've also heard a variation of that from I've heard a variation of this from like John Lennox, sort of his rhetorical question that he'll ask to scientists is like what do you use to do your science? And then they'll say, well, I'll use my brain. And then he'll ask, well, you see that computer over there that you're using for, or that instrument that you're using, if that was created by blind, unguided natural processes, would you trust it to do your science? And they usually answer, well, no, I wouldn't. Then the rhetorical question that comes up is then, well, do you trust your brain? Because it stands to reason that the same logic would have to apply. So anyway, this is very similar. It's premise 1: if naturalism and evolution are both true, then our cognitive faculties cannot be trusted. That just means, for instance, you have to explain, for instance, things like, why are there different people groups that disagree fundamentally about their epistemologies? You have two different cultures, for instance, and one of them is Muslim and the other is Christian, or one of them is atheistic and the other is Buddhist, what makes one right or the other wrong? They're both deriving at their conclusions based on either determined or chance factors, right? And so what is your tool in essence to uncover the truth? And the answer is that if naturalism and evolution are both true, then you can't really decipher which one is true. Premise 2, anyone who admits their cognitive faculties cannot be trusted really should not be trusted. I mean, their arguments are all going to fail, not just like arguments against God or arguments for naturalism. Just every argument that they make is not going to have any kind of sound basis anymore. Conclusion, therefore, naturalism and evolution cannot be rationally held simultaneously. You can maybe hold one or the other, but you can't hold them both. So that's often shorted to the EAAN, the evolutionary argument against naturalism. Okay, so I think I have a couple more here, or I have one more. The syllogism for mind-brain dualism. Okay, so premise 1, if the mind and the brain are identical, they must share all the same properties. And so that's basically Leibniz's law, or the principle of sufficient reason. Premise 2, the mind has properties that the brain does not, such as being non-spatial, private, and having intentionality, aboutness, agency, I'd say. So like, if you take, for instance, an idea, a thought, a memory, can you divide it? Can you cut it in half? That doesn't make any sense. It seems like that's a property that isn't material. And if the mind has properties that are not material, then it can't be the brain, because the brain has only material properties. It seems like you can keep thoughts to yourself, even when you get like a brain scan. You're not you're not having your mind read. And then, there is intentionality and aboutness. For instance, there's nothing about there's nothing when I pick up this pen, like this pen doesn't have anything in and of itself that is directed towards some end, except that I do, or any other mind directs it towards, which would seem to suggest that a mind is separate from the brain. So that would be the conclusion. Therefore, the mind and the brain are not identical. So this would mean dualism would have to be true if these two premises are true. Okay, so those are my slides. If anyone wants to come up and have a conversation about, they can choose from any of these. Again, here are the arguments. There's the Kalam, cosmological argument, fine-tuning argument, moral argument, intelligent design argument, ontological argument from a priori truths, the argument from agency, the argument from desire, the argument from contingency, the argument from intelligibility, multiverse argument against naturalism, evolutionary argument against naturalism, and the syllogism for multi-brain dualism. If anyone has any qualms with these, or if anyone thinks that they have a good reason for why God doesn't exist and they think that they can change my mind, I am down to listen. I'm down to be open-minded, and I'd love to hear it. So feel free to click that link. It's just linked right at the top of the screen, right at the top. So feel free to hit that StreamYard link. I think you need, I don't know if you need a computer, but I think you might need a computer. And yep, I think that's about all I had for presentation wise. So I'll remove this from the studio. And I await a challenger, if one exists. Maybe there could be an argument made about that. If no one comes up, what I could do is I can answer if you just want to write in the chat and you want to write some criticisms there, I'm totally down to do that too. You don't have to join StreamYard. Okay, here's something. What's your response to the claim? What's your response to the claim? Fine-tuning of the universe is a god of the gaps argument. So, what is the definition of god of the gaps then? So basically, it's an argument from ignorance, right? So, or is this strictly syllogism stuff? It is syllogism stuff, but your criticism still works. Your criticism still works either way. I mean, but what I'd say to it is, we want to basically understand the nature of what a god of the gaps argument is, and it's essentially pointing to, for instance, like someone would maybe in ancient Greece, or like take for instance like the Nordic god Thor. They might point to like thunder and say, hey, that came from the thunder god. Or you might even have an archaic culture that looks at something like, I don't know, like the planets moving around the earth and say, God is holding up the planets, right? And in these cases, like, these are explanations for what these are, yeah, they're causal explanations for what's happening. They're not exactly the same as inferences to the best explanation. So basically, an argument from ignorance implies that you don't have information, and so you're basing your reasoning on an absence of information. I think that the distinction to be made here is that when you look at things like the fine-tuning argument, that's sort of like a probabilistic argument. There are three different modes in which the universe could be created, and one of them is design, one of them is chance, and one of them's sort of determinism, or like a reductionism view. And then you ask which is the best fit based on the evidence. And the fine-tuning argument is going to say, well, if chance is an option, it sure is statistically unlikely that chance created this universe. If everything is reductionistic and deterministic, it sure is unlikely that a universe would have things like teleology, for instance, or order and structure instead of chaos. Yeah. And again, it is a probability argument. That's good. Yeah, it's a pretty prevalent criticism. It's not a bad criticism. I think it's used too often though, because I think there are cases in which God of the Gaps is a legitimate response to an argument. The problem is when it's sort of used as a rebuttal for everything that a theist says. Actually, I wrote an article a while back on my blog, which is the same name. It's a creationquestions.blog, and it was talking about a sort of an interview that I saw with what is his name? The Dwight from The Office. You know that guy? Do you know his name? I can't remember. I'll look it up real quick. Dwight. Oh yeah, Rainn Wilson. So Rainn Wilson has his own podcast, and he interviewed Alex O'Connor, who used to go by was it Cosmic Skeptic, and basically in this interview near the beginning of it, Alex O'Connor said, "You can make an argument for God based on the sheer number of arguments for God." And I laughed at that. I thought it was so funny, and so I wrote an article, and I tried to form a syllogism based on an argument for the inference of the plausibility of God based on the sheer number of basically compelling arguments for God, which I think is kind of hilarious and a little bit meta. But anyway, I don't know if that's been formulated before, but I got the inspiration from Alex O'Connor. I might have to put that one in my slides if I do this again. DNA prescriptive information seems to have the same problem. It makes most sense with design, as we haven't seen natural code arise. Yeah, I've put forward this argument a lot, the argument from design here. I'll put it up again. Okay. Yeah, the intelligent design argument. I've sort of put forward variations on different forums. I posted it on Reddit at one point. And a common criticism I get of this argument is just that evolution can sort of explain genetic diversity. Like if evolution can explain the way that, for instance, bees communicate with one another, and if that's solely a genetic process, it stands to reason that, well, actually, DNA, yes, it's a code, but codes can evolve because we see it happen. And I guess I'd push back because I think there, for instance, if we look at the last universal common ancestor, or the population rather, we see things like, for instance, almost all of the major protein families all existed in this original common group. And the reason why they do really is because evolution has a really hard time actually of explaining new information. So they kind of have to push it back before where their evolutionary mechanisms start working. For instance, there is something called fitness landscapes, and if you take a protein folding, let me see. They can't call it code. They can't call it code. They have to say code is only an analogy. Well, some of them call it code. Like, for instance, I know Dawkins calls it code. Here, let me show you. If I can share this screen here. Put it on YouTube. Okay, so I don't know if you're going to be able to hear the audio here real quick. But I'm going to unshare this, and I'm going to present this. Oops. I'm sorry, I'm new to this. Okay, here we go.
Is the genetic code really a code?
It is a code. It's definitely a code. And it is a code that's put together, not by a designer, but by natural selection. It's very easy to see how that can happen in principle. Details, of course, need to be worked out. But nevertheless, there is no problem in saying that DNA would be a code in just the same kind of way as a computer code. It certainly is a code. You can read it as a code. You could even transcribe. I think I put this in River Out of Eden. You could even transcribe a book into DNA letters, and you could read it out again. You could preserve it in DNA. That's how code-like it is. It really is completely code-like code. A digital code is merely quaternary rather than binary. And of course, it's not put together by a designer. It's put together by natural selection.
Yeah. I think maybe the best way to go about this is to just try and talk about what information is in general. I mean, or we could talk about computer code in general too, because that one.
I'll pause it for now. But you get the gist of that. Yeah. Refuse to call it a code. I mean, a lot of them do, though. I know several. I know several microbiologists, molecular biologists, that they tend to run their mouths about how DNA is not a code. But I think by any definition of a code, you're going to have to call DNA a code. I think there's really no escaping it. Just for the reasons that I lay out, it's semiotic in nature, and all semiotic things are just like they're codes. That's basically how a code is defined. It's linguistic, and it contains anything that contains signs, signified things, and signifiers. So basically, like the signs signify objects. And the objects are not the signs, and the signs are not the objects. Well, then you've got a problem. Where are chemical, where are physical laws and chemistry dictating the relationship there? And in the case of the ribosome and the tRNAs and the mRNA and the amino acids, it's a relationship that's all dictated by DNA. Well, where DNA is instructing how you're going to read the DNA. All of these things are part of the code. So it's interesting. It's like a book that's instructing you how to read the book and how to interpret the book. It's like basically it's a blueprint or recipe book. So it's very hard to see how it wouldn't be a code. Unlike a snowflake, DNA has prescriptive information, so I agree it's a code. Yeah, it's prescriptive. Yeah, you're right. And unfortunately for a lot of naturalists, people who think, or materialists. Materialists would be people who think that everything can be reduced to the laws of physics and chemistry, whereas naturalist says all that exists is nature. It's more of a negative claim, but either way, they're both going to have to explain DNA as something emergent from the bottom up, not top down. And it's just not likely that higher level systems can be created bottom up. It's like we never observed that. That defies our observation. Materialists live in a purposeless universe. Yeah, that's interesting. I think in an objective sense that, yeah, like in the totality of existence, their lives don't matter from their perspective. But also from their perspective, their lives are meaningful and their relationships are meaningful. And I think they think that that's because it's relative to their experience. But actually, I think you do have to reconcile that. You can't just say that your life is meaningful, but also it's objectively not meaningful. I think that's a strange conclusion. And I mean, like, you can have things that make you feel like you have purpose, but then that begs the question, where is purpose? And like the argument from desire, the question is like, if there is some real object, like for instance, the feeling of purpose, which, well, it doesn't look like time can satisfy it. There's nothing on Earth that can satisfy it, and there's certainly no creature that can satisfy it on Earth. Then the question is, where does that come from? And it sort of begs the question, well, it should come from God. Yep. They think they do, right? It's sort of, yeah, it is sort of a self-delusion in some sense. And that's why it feels to them like, the reason why they feel like they have purpose is because they do have purpose. The reason why they don't think they have purpose is because they don't like their objective purpose that they have. Or at least they don't believe that they have that objective purpose in some sense. And that all gets kind of complicated because I don't want to say that I can know what's in someone's head. I think that's a dangerous affair. Cool. I'll take credit for that. So yeah. I suppose if we wanted to, we could just watch the rest of this video and see what Dawkins has to say about information. I think that would be interesting. Then maybe we'll call it quits after that. Here we go.
One of the things I think maybe the best way to go about this is to just try and talk about what information is in general. I mean, or we could talk about computer code in general too, because that one of the things I think a lot of people in my generation have difficulty understanding. We think of code as this magical thing because the computers that we have are basically like, they work like magic to us. Smartphones are so far beyond our comprehension that we can't make sense of them. Whereas when you were first working with computers, things were a lot more mechanical. How they worked was a lot more obvious. Maybe talking about your experience with that would be helpful.
Well, it's true that when I did in my career, I have had a sort of rather misspent youth. And part of that was writing machine code programs. And with machine code programs, you really are very close to the hardware. you're writing in assembly language, which is just one removed from writing down ones and noughts, and you have to be very familiar with the ones and noughts. So you're very acquainted with the idea that it really is digital. There's a piece of computer tape which is very familiar to me, because when I first started computing, we did everything on punch paper tape like that. In America, at the same time, they were using punch cards. It's the same idea. Mm-hmm. But in Britain, British computers had punch paper tape. So you really were right down there among the digits, among the binary digits, among the noughts and ones, and got a very clear conception of the relationship between writing a program and actually putting noughts and ones into the computer. You could even correct errors by changing a one into a naught, or by actually literally punching an extra hole.
But then, like, the question arises: you can get a clear idea of how they're related, how those punched holes are related to the program, right? But is that clear idea? Is that a material thing? Can that be reduced to the holes in the paper, or some sort of like electrical signal? Is there not anything more than electrical signals that is happening cause that program? Does that program mean anything? Is meaning part of that paper of punched holes? If it's part of the paper of punched holes, then I should be able to take some of those punched holes and like throw them, like fold it into a paper airplane and throw it to somebody else, and they should figure out what it is, right? But actually, if they figure out what it is, did they figure out what it is because the meaning existed on the internal to the paper? Was it the paper that was meaningful, or was it like the holes that were meaningful? What was holding the meaning there? Sure, it's a physical thing that's holding the meaning, but like, where is the meaning in the physical thing? Here we go. Someone named Evo. So I'm assuming we have a skeptic here, and maybe they can correct me if I'm wrong. But just to read out this: granting both premises as true, how does it follow that the thing we desire, metaphysical supposedly, is a real thing? Why is it true that because we desire something that thing must I'm assuming exist? So why is it true that we desire something that the thing must exist? It's going to be an inferential explanation. So like in our everyday experience, right? Everything that we desire, there's something that satisfies it. And there should be, like, even on an evolutionary view, why would you desire anything if it didn't exist, right? Unless you're like defective, but then you'll probably be selected against. But also, do you accept metaphysical truths? That's the question. Maybe you can answer these, but I'm going to continue on to the video.
Right.
In that tape, or even sticking a bit of tape over a hole that shouldn't be there. We're that close to it.
I didn't even know that these things existed until maybe a couple of months ago. I started looking this up. I was so interested in the similarity between these old punch tape computers and the ribosome, because it's reading this a lot like messenger RNA. You know, you've got
it is.
You know, each what do you call this? Each byte here is
yes.
would be like a codon.
That's an 8-bit tape, I think. Yes.
Yeah.
I was using first of all 5-bit tapes and then 8-bit tapes. Yes, that's right. Yeah. In a way, tape is better than cards for that analogy. But
oh, and just so you know, codons are 3 nucleotides long, and they'll code for one of 20 amino acids. So they're part of the mRNA sequence that the ribosome and tRNAs read. Just so for background,
because cards are discrete objects. If you drop them on the floor, it's a very bad thing I discovered when I went to America and started having to use punch cards. But tape is much more like DNA because it is a long string. And so the analogy is even closer in a trivial sense, of course.
I think that maybe that's one of the reasons that people have difficulty understanding the link between the genetic code and computer code is because, that basic machine code language is none of us experience. None of us interact with that anymore. And it actually made me think, I wonder if DNA hadn't been discovered right after, we were breaking codes in World War II. And then when people were using stuff like this, I wonder if it would have taken us longer to figure out the genetic code, or if we ever even would have, if we discovered DNA at the wrong point in history,
Interesting. Yes, that's an interesting thought. And you're right, of course, that nowadays, since we're a little bit further away from the machine code level, we're accustomed to dealing with computers at a higher level, where we're dealing with whole programs, and it's almost as though the computers are sort of human. I mean, we talk about...
So I believe that Francis Crick, for instance, I think he was a like a code cracker and code breaker in World War II, right? And so I have one of his, like, this was a fairly popular book in its day. This is a Francis Crick book. It's called Of Molecules and Men. And in here it talks about things like he talks about vitalism, for instance, and he's by the way he's a hardline reductionist. He's a materialist, and he'll say things like, here's a little excerpt. Actually, I like to read the preface because it's very funny. It kind of reminds me of like a modern Reddit post. If you've ever been on Reddit, I don't know, maybe you shouldn't be, but so this preface is this is not a scholarly work on the history of vitalism. If it were, I should have had to refer at some length to earlier writers like Hans Driesch and Henry Bergson, to say nothing of contemporaries such as Teilhard de I'm terrible at French, so forgive my pronunciation, but Teilhard de Chardin and Michael Polanyi. I'm very much out of sympathy with both these thinkers, fashionable though they may be in literary circles. Polanyi, for example, believes that a steam engine cannot be totally described in terms of physics and chemistry. It is clear that he and I are using this expression in quite different ways. So I love it. And then he goes on, like, as he does not really believe, and he's talking about Polanyi, in the central importance of natural selection, it is not surprising that he runs into logical and philosophical difficulties of all kinds. And he's just like, it's so goofy. He's like, rather, I have taken vitalism as a theme, and I've written down the sort of thing that I find my friends and colleagues are saying about our present and future knowledge of biology. So, thus, this is not a literary or philosophical work, but a collection of scientific results and ideas. So, basically, like, what he does through this book is he argues that essentially he's making a God of the Gaps kind of thing. There are parts of reality that different scientists suppose were sort of outside of the regular laws and chemistry of nature. And he writes, this is for the general thesis of his book. He says, we see a complicated pattern of behavior. And yes, he says, it will be my general thesis that the reason the need is felt for a doctrine like vitalism is because we see a complicated pattern of behavior which we cannot easily explain in terms of the concepts that are immediately available to us. It thus is useful to examine in a little more detail these areas of biology where the difficulties are most apparent. So he goes through organic versus non-organic chemistry, thermodynamic laws, physical foundations of biology, and he basically shows like, well, basically we'll figure it out. Like, we don't know it all right now, but we'll figure it out. And I think that is interesting. I think that's very interesting, because if you're going to argue that vitalism is God of the gaps, but you're essentially going to say, oh, vitalism is God of the gaps, but we'll eventually solve all these things via natural processes. Like, all of this will be explained reductionistically. I think you're begging the question. I think you're actually doing a sort of naturalism of the gaps at that point. So that's another interesting thought when it comes to the question, Mr. Green, that you were mentioning earlier. Oh, I see that. I'm sorry, Ifo. You put something up on the chat. Let me read it. Our yearning of God seems inadequate, to me at least. I would also probably reject premise 2 for how you seem to imply our desires and relationships to them. Okay, so let me pull up that again. Premise 2. There exists in us a desire which nothing in time, nothing on earth, and no creature can satisfy. So I guess the question is going to be, oh, I forgot the part above. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Wait a minute. Okay, it starts here, I'm assuming. Okay. I could suppose, I'm sorry, by the way. I could suppose that as true for simple things like food and water. But to make the jump for something as complex and intricate as a metaphysical being, when there are physiological explanations for our yearning of God, seems inadequate. Okay. So our yearning of just having a yearning of God seems inadequate when there are potential psychological explanations, and maybe even I don't know if you'd say, but maybe even physiological explanations. Well, sure. I mean, like, there's a physiological explanation for hunger. That doesn't mean that food doesn't exist. That doesn't explain away food. Like, you might have a physiological desire for like a sexual desire. That doesn't mean that intercourse doesn't exist. You might have a desire for relationships. Doesn't mean relationships don't exist. Like, you could explain it via just the psychological or physiological desire, but it doesn't explain away. That doesn't actually discount premise 2. Does that make sense? Or will you reject, let me see. Reject premise 2 for how he seems to imply our desires and relationships to them. Well, there's some sort of relationship there. And I don't think can you deny that there's some relationship there? It doesn't seem to me that you can. And interesting, is the hang up for you that a metaphysical being, like aka God, is complex and intricate? Is that the hang up for you? And why would that be a hang up? For instance, is it more of a hang up if I'm hungry to eat something like bread rather than rather than honey or something? I mean, both are complicated. Maybe something like some like tiki masala or like some French cuisine or something. Is the complexity going to change? Okay, let me see. With premise 2, also the claim, there exists a desire which nothing can we really claim that is true? I say no. Okay, and you're free to claim that premise 2 is not true on that grounds. But it seems like intuitively there does exist some sort of meaning. There does seem to exist some kind of purpose or telos about us where we don't necessarily feel fulfilled even in like attaining a lot of wealth, even really with like good relationships, although people usually do feel pretty fulfilled when they have like solid relationships, but those things are kind of, I mean, they can be fallible or they can end. They're not infinite, but we do have a sort of desire for an infinite interestedness, to use Kierkegaard's term. So we kind of did finish kind of finish that video. I want to see, is there anything interesting going on? Maybe we could watch a criticism of one of these arguments. Does anyone have a good video that critiques one of these? Maybe the Kalam, for instance. Kalam is an interesting argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. I think that's interesting. Of course, some person is going to say like, well, maybe there's different kinds of things that begin to exist. For instance, like God is supposedly creating things ex nihilo. Sorry. And whereas humans, when we like create something like a chair, ooh, want to talk about it? Yeah, come up. Yeah, feel free to click that invite, or I mean, you can talk in the comments too. But if you want to talk in person, I'm down. But yeah, like I was saying, it seems like there is some sort of categorical difference between what is a chair. Especially, there are a lot of people that are going to say, well, what is a chair? It's not really. Is it just like what's useful to call a chair because of how we use it? Is it just it's just useful for us as pragmatic to call something a chair, but it's not really a chair? If you think about it, it's just really a bunch of atoms that are stuck together or in some sort of relationship. Whereas to create all the atoms, that seems like something different. But I think what this is getting at is there is such a thing as causal chains, and there is such a thing as a chair as such. Like there is a moment when something does become a chair, and you can be sort of pedantic about like, well, what, like before I put the last leg of the chair on, is it not a chair? And to some extent, like you could say, well, no, it's not a chair. I don't know. I think my intuition would be like, before you put the last leg on a chair, it kind of is still a chair, but something has to exist, like some mind has to exist to call it a chair. I mean, I suppose the person making a cake or making a chair or making whatever you want to say, before any of the components are all together, I suppose you could say the ingredients in themselves don't constitute that thing, but the intention is already there. There's already, and maybe this gets into a little bit of like a Platonic view, but I don't necessarily think that forms have to exist just in the ether. I think where forms maybe can truly be or rightly be said to exist is in a mind, and then that gets into a whole nother philosophical debate. But I don't think that nominalism is true, for the simple reason that You have to have, if you put something in a category, you have then identified it in a genus of things. So you now have a species in a genus, and genuses are, if something's in a genus, then it can't be nominal. It can't just be by name. There has to be some sort of definition for that thing. Let me see. 2 points with the kalam. One, I am kind of fine granting the argument, but it doesn't necessarily imply mind. Interesting. Yeah, and that is the common criticism for a lot of people. The universe could just be contingent on another inanimate mind. Interesting. Second, appealing to science, physics. Second, appealing to science, physicists wouldn't make the claim the laws of causality persist at the Big Bang. So they wouldn't make the claim the laws of physics, the laws of causality persist at the Big Bang. Well, I think maybe at the Big Bang, but maybe not before the Big Bang or something like that. But like the laws of causality emerge. Is that what you're saying? Inanimate object. Wait, are you replacing inanimate mind with inanimate object? The universe could just be contingent on another inanimate object. Oh, I see. Well, here's the problem with that, though. What is the universe? The universe is the material. It's the space in which the material lies, and it's the time in which the material persists. So what would it mean for an object to create the material space and time before it persists? That would sort of be saying, well, a constituent part, a part of the whole created the whole, and that sort of is a contradiction. But to speak on your other points, going back to the first comment here, 2 points with the kalam. So your first point is that it doesn't necessarily imply mind. The universe could just be contingent on an object. Okay, so that was your first point, but I see two things in here. For instance, I think for some people, it's fine that, or maybe there is part of the universe, like some substratum, like a quantum fluctuation or a quantum field, or some sort of, like, some people say, like gravity or some mathematical laws. And what I would say to that is just like, well, all of those things, they still imply a mind. They still imply, they either, one, imply a mind and are contingent upon a mind, or two, they imply the universe and are contingent upon the universe. And what the argument argues is that the universe is contingent on a cause, and that cause has to be immaterial because the universe is material, has to be outside the universe, has to be spaceless because the universe is within space, and has to be spaceless. It has to be timeless as well because the universe persists in time. So I mean that's an interesting point, but I think the implications of the conclusion for the kalam are just, and maybe they can be more clearly seen in which one is it? Maybe they can be more clearly seen in the argument for contingency, but sort of the same kind of idea. Anything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either intrinsically or extrinsically. So the universe doesn't exist extrinsically. Or sorry, it doesn't exist intrinsically. It doesn't exist on its own merits. It has to exist on something else's merits. So to say that something within the universe exists prior to the universe, like a part of the universe exists prior to the universe, is saying that something that exists contingent on something that exists contingent on something else persisted before the thing that it's contingent on. And so that doesn't necessarily follow. I think honestly the best way to refute the Kalam cosmological argument is to attack premise 2, because we do have good evidence from things like the start of the universe, like the Big Bang, and I know that's not necessarily the start of the universe, but we have good evidence of a sort of structure and trajectory of the universe. And you could put other things like, I'm not sure what you're saying. Okay. What about what I'm saying is confusing? It could be that I just said so much at once. I do have a whiteboard. I don't know if that could be useful, but or maybe I'll just try to. I wish I had some props. But basically, okay. So you have this thing. This is the universe, right? This whole thing is contingent, and this whole thing needs something to start it off, right? Now, can you say that anything in this started it off? Right? Does that make sense? And what do you answer to that, right? The whole contingency stuff. Right, okay. So there are two kinds of things, right? There are things that are non-contingent and there are things that are contingent. A contingent thing is an effect of some other cause. A non-contingent thing is basically its own reason for existing. It's transcendent of cause and effect, in a sense. Does that make sense? But what? Incomplete sentence? Fragment? Yeah, just going back to the... Oh. Okay, so here's an interesting comment. Okay. I almost feel discussing metaphysical matters is useless as we just do not know. So we just do not know metaphysical matters. Is that the claim? And then presupposing logic, causality, etc., seems impossible to justify that they necessarily exist elsewhere. So the first part, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you're saying that we don't know anything about metaphysical matters. And in what sense do we not know anything? We don't know if they necessarily exist elsewhere. So you're saying we can't know if they're outside of our minds because we only experience them in our minds. Is that kind of the argument that you're going for? I don't want to straw man you, so you can feel free to elaborate on that. But just for the sake of argument, let's say that's what you're saying. I think... Ooh, okay. We use out human inference to debate the inconceivable. Not really making an argument. No, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, but just for the sake of argument, not saying you're making an argument, but just for the sake of argument, if you're going to say that metaphysical matters, we can't know if they're outside of our mind, I guess the question would be like, this is going to get back to like epistemics. Okay. I'm going to get back to my thought, but just to answer this. Black Apple says, of course, a God caused the universe. But why would God be a human man? That's a good question, and I'd love to discuss that at a different time, because today we're talking about basically like, why does God exist? Why does he not exist? And sort of tied into that is sort of like the naturalism question, the metaphysical question. But oh, I'm sorry. If you'd like to come up, we can talk about it, but I'm not going to talk about it in the comments because it's kind of off topic. Bye. Okay. So yeah, going back to, oh, sorry, I'll go back to this page here. So yeah, premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. So yeah, I'd say the strongest point here is arguing against the universe beginning to exist. Oh wait, oh, we were just talking about what were we talking about? Oh, metaphysics. Okay, yeah. So what was the kind of point I was trying to get at? Oh yeah, I almost feel like metaphysical matters are useless because, but here's the thought then. Oh yeah, okay, that's fine. Don't mind me talking about this question then. Just if you want to watch it later, that's fine. But have a good night. So if all that exists, so if our minds are really what dictate a priori propositions like logic, math, math being like arithmetic and geometry, and you could put into there like maybe even moral truths. You could put in sort of like other kinds of like, and I'm sure there are other synthetic a priori that I'm forgetting, but basically things that you can construct just exclusively in your mind, or allegedly you can. And so there are a lot of philosophers, like for instance, Kant is going to say, well, you can't. Kant is going to say, the only way that we experience the world is through a faculty that has both the a priori sort of like embedded in itself and the experience from our from whatever kind of like sense experience that we have, right? So we don't actually have isolated sense experience. Like, for instance, David Hume is going to say we can have isolated sense experience, which gets into, it opens a whole nother can of worms. Like, for instance, and like Reed is going to point out, and others are going to point out, well, you can't really have pure sense experience because any kind of sense that you have is implying a cause of that. It's a sign, it's implying an object. And so you have this faculty of common sense, which is not just like, it's not just like a dismissive thing about Hume. A lot of people get that wrong about Reed. He's not dismissing Hume. He's saying that basically every every sort of like experience that you sense does imply something that you have no access to. You don't have any access to, like, for instance, well, just anything in the outside world, anything in the noumenal world, like Kant would say. But you have access to its effects, and that's something that Reed has in common with Charles Sanders Peirce, is that we have access to the effects. So it's not like we have no access to the noumena, is what it's called. And basically what is the noumena? The noumena is the real world versus the phenomenal world, which is all the changes that hit us, right? It hits our senses. But basically going back to like backtracking way back now, the mind, like, how do we know that math, for instance, is not just like something that's we created, right? And the answer to that is because like we couldn't create it. We presuppose it to have any kind of experience. We presuppose math, so we can't create it. It just exists. And whether or not we believe in it or not, whether we think it's true or not, it doesn't actually change. And it's not something that we can argue about. I mean, we can argue about it, but it's not something that's too valid. There's not two valid positions for any given presuppositional argument. In fact, to assume that valid positions exist is to presume a priori judgments like logical laws. So that's basically why things in a mind don't just exist in a mind. A priori things don't just exist in the mind. And that's also kind of why we can have some sort of valid interpretation of the world, and we can feel like we have some sort of real interpretation, some concrete understanding of the world. Whereas if there was absolutely nothing outside of our observations to help us make judgments, we wouldn't be able to categorize things. We wouldn't be able to do a lot of what Hume wants us to do, even though Hume says that cause and effect don't exist in his sort of thesis about the science of man. Like, cause and effect have to exist synthetically in the a priori before you even start observing things. So the sense experience assumes it. So yeah, it's like you're not really there's no real escaping the idea that things exist outside of your mind, like a priori propositions, like synthetical judgments. So yeah, I mean, if anyone else has any comments, I'm open to discussing any kind of, again, just to relay, we have the Kalam cosmological argument, fine-tuning argument. It's basically the universe is fine-tuned, and then we look at the inference to the best explanation here, and we say it's design, and it's not chance or like the deterministic or reductionistic laws. And then we look at the moral argument, and we see that moral values exist, and we conclude, therefore, a lawgiver exists. Intelligent design argument, this is basically form and function and information exist. And ontological argument, there is a greatest conceivable being. You can conceive of a greatest conceivable being. A greatest conceivable being is more great if it's not just conceived, but it is in fact in every possible world. Argument from a priori truths, like I was saying a little bit earlier, truths that are in the mind, like a priori truths are they're not contingent on us thinking them are true. Like if we think that an a priori truth is true, that's good, but it's not true because we thought it was true. And that means that they're not contingent. Like a priori truths exist outside all contingent minds. Therefore, a priori truths exist in a non-contingent mind. And that follows pretty easily. And then this is an interesting argument. And yeah, I think it's up there with some of my favorite. Honestly, I think the Kalam is one of my favorite, even though there's so many qualifying factors to it. But anyway, argument from agency. If naturalism is true, all human actions are the result of physical laws and prior physical states. Premise 2, human beings possess true agency, the ability to initiate actions freely and intentionally, like libertarian free will. Therefore, naturalism is false, and there must exist a transcendent source of agency. So then the question is, like, if we do have agency, and you can even point back to the Imago Dei, right? then where does it come from? Argument from desire. This is an argument that we hit on a little bit during our live chat discussion. Basically, every natural innate desire corresponds to some real object, and you can't, and there's different explanations for innate desires, right? You can explain the physiological, the psychological part, the aspect, but that doesn't explain away the fact that there is something real that satisfies that desire. Yet, in spite of, what some people might say, there does exist a desire in us which nothing in time, nothing on earth, and no creature can satisfy. Therefore, there must be something more than those factors, those material factors. Again, argument from contingency, Leibnizian argument. Premise 1, anything that exists has an explanation of its existence. It's very similar to the Kalam, either intrinsically or extrinsically. Premise 2, neither the universe does not have to exist by its own nature. It exists extrinsically. And then premise, final conclusion, therefore the universe must have an extrinsic explanation. Finally, we have a few arguments against naturalism. Argument from intelligibility. If our minds are the products of material processes, they are not capable of grasping abstract truth, yet they are. Therefore, minds are not the products of purely unguided natural processes. Multiverse argument against naturalism, and this is an argument that hits the fine-tuning objective of the multiverse specifically. So if anyone wants to say, well, the universe just is designed because there are so many universes, well, the question is, what constitutes these universes? If you're going to say that they have different kinds of physical laws, different kinds of matter, or different kinds of energy, then it's not true that there only exists things that are composed of the observed constituents that we see in nature. And then naturalism has to be false. So if the multiverse is true, that basically is the death knell to any kind of naturalist view, and especially materialist views, because materialist views don't even have any kind of they don't have any kind of notion of material, of anything but material. Did I skip one? Yes, then the evolutionary argument against naturalism. Premise 1, if naturalism and evolution are both true, then our cognitive faculties cannot be trusted. Premise 2, anyone who admits their cognitive faculties cannot be trusted should not be trusted. Therefore, naturalism and evolution cannot be rationally held simultaneously. Lastly, this is an argument for dualism, which I think is another argument against naturalism, because if dualism is true, it follows that naturalism is false. And also, if naturalism is false, guys, it means that the conclusions of all the theistic arguments are raised, like their probabilities are raised. But premise 1 is if the mind and the brain are identical, they must share all the same properties. This is the Leibniz's law, or what is often called the principle of sufficient reason. And I'm fine using a principle of sufficient reason. That's not a hard principle of sufficient reason for this. It still follows. Premise 2, the mind has properties that the brain does not, such as being non-spatial, private, and having intentionality and aboutness, or what you could call libertarian free will. Oh, sorry. You could call, like, for instance, like our thoughts, our agency, our free will, all these kind of things. They can't be divided. You can't parse them in a material sense. And they're exclusive to you. They don't exist for anyone else, really. And no one else has access to your thoughts. No one has access to your desires. And then they all have this kind of ends. They have the means and an ends kind of thing. And that means and ends can be wholly separate from any kind of material process. And all these things exist where the brain is supposed to exist. I mean, like, if the brain explains these things, where is it in the brain? Where are these things? I mean, you can see things lighting up, but do you see thoughts lighting up? No, not really. And then conclusion follows. Therefore, the mind and the brain are not identical. So, all that being said, I will wait if anyone wants to challenge the thesis, if anyone wants to come up, feel free. You're invited to come up. Anyone can come up. It's an open discussion. So yeah, I'll wait. I don't know. I'll wait maybe a few minutes. We could watch something else, or looks like not really a lot of comments or anything left. So I think maybe we'll just wrap it up. All right, guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks for engaging. I appreciate it. I mean, it's kind of like the second real video on this channel, and you don't have to be here. So I hope you gained something from it. And sorry about all the technical glitches and weird things. I was a little bit nervous at the beginning, but hopefully you can look past that, at least this time. So appreciate you guys. Thanks for watching. Take care.